So I think the land issue, it has many dimensions. One, as I mentioned earlier, it is the most important asset that people have. Now the World Bank's policy on Sri Lanka now for some time has been that agriculture is unproductive. So now you will hear a lot of neoclassical or economists or neoliberals say that 30% of our population is involved in agriculture, but agriculture only produces 10% of our GDP. Right? So their solution, and the World Bank has come out with a number of reports on Sri Lanka, what they want to see is the large section of the rural population move to the cities. So they want to get them off the land, because in terms of their model, the productivity is low in agriculture. There is no need for these people to be involved in agriculture. Let's get them to the cities. They don't really have a plan of what these people will do in the cities, but they are willing to take the risk to throw people into the cities. Now this was what was happening in England, I would say 250 years ago, with primitive accumulation, right? So people were shipped to the cities, they live in all kinds of conditions in the cities, and then they assume that somehow growth will happen, the industries will begin, and then there will be much higher productivity. So this move to make land a marketable commodity is also tied to this process of rural to urban migration. Now what happens after that, either they don't care about or they are not thinking through to all those people. Why do people stay in the rural areas? Of course, rural agriculture is much less productive, but they are able to find maybe the food security, they are able to maintain their livelihoods at a certain basic level in the rural areas, which even that they might lose when they come to the city. There is no, I think what is interesting in this budget, even though Ranil claims he's going to create 1 million jobs, I'm not sure where those jobs are going to come from, because there's no policy of job creation, there's no policy of industrialization, to even if we decided to go that route, of how this labor will be absorbed. They're just saying that they're going to create it, and they want to create the conditions for migration, they want to create the conditions so that labor is weakened, but there is no policy, there is no plan to create those jobs. So it's a very dangerous situation where they want to get people off the land, get people away from the basic way of surviving, but they have no real alternative. But why do they want to do that? Right? Which comes to the question of also financialization. Because they, in some ways, I would argue, like the Rajapaksas, have a very short-term, immediate outlook. Their own immediate concern is how do they get foreign capital to keep coming into the country. In other words, you have to roll over your foreign debt, which is about 35% of our GDP. About 70% of our GDP we are indebted, of which about half, 35% I think, is foreign debt. So they have to roll over that debt, they have to get more debt, and they have to keep this finance coming into the country. How are they going to invite that? Normally, if foreign direct investment comes in, what do they expect? Or any kind of investment comes in, they expect a return on the money that comes in. Now normally you would think, okay, you build a factory, in 5 years time you produce a profit, and that is your return, right? And that is how you also pay back all the investment in infrastructure. You build a highway, somebody has to pay for it. If the assumption is that you build a highway, there will be a factory that is built next to that highway that will produce then the returns to be able to pay for the factory and the road connecting it. There is no plan like that. What they are counting on is this money has to come in. But what is the incentive for this foreign capital to come in? That they can invest in real estate, and then the real estate will show a profit, and then they can make the profit and leave. In the short term it works, but then you have to keep that bubble going. This is what has happened with neoliberalism around the world. It has been much more on speculation than on this kind of productive investment. So why do people want to, why does a government want to encourage this kind of financialization? One is because once you go on that path, you need more financialization. In other words, once you start a bubble economy, you need the bubble to become bigger and bigger until it bursts. On the other hand, it also suits a regime because there are some people who gain a lot in that process. Now, when Mahinda Rajapaksa went the route of financialization, and there were people who are very close to his regime who made a killing. This is the kind of money that, in the old kind of industrial model takes 10, 15 years. Now suddenly, in the course through speculative finance, in a few years, you accumulate a lot. So there is that interest for also local regimes to go this route of the bubble economy, because with speculative finance you can have huge amount of rent seeking or a lot of high accumulation in a short period of time. So the global finance capital also comes in to speculate, but the intermediaries, the local financiers also make a lot of money. Now, in terms of the question about what we think of the service sector, the problem is what kind of an economy, what kind of economic vision we have, and what kind of economic model we have. Whether it was Mahinda Rajapaksa, he took a lot of pride in saying he's going to build an economy that grows 8% a year. Ranil Wickremesinghe in 2000, I don't think he has put a target as such, maybe he has. In 2002, he said he wants a Sri Lanka that grows at 10% a year. Regaining Sri Lanka was a policy package to have 10% growth. Once you want that kind of a growth, what are the policies that you can follow? What they do is they emphasize construction. Because the moment even if you borrow money and you construct roads, you construct the city, construction can become a very high-speed growing industry. And that is what everybody likes to put cement. Even our education budget is this time quite high, but a lot of it is to build buildings. And with that you can show very high growth. But will there be the return to sustain that is the question. The other thing, in terms of global capital and the IMF and the World Bank, who are backed by global capital, their emphasis has been what they call FIRE, F-I-R-E, finance, insurance and real estate. Right? And this is important because this is where the most amount of speculative accumulation can happen. In finance, insurance, real estate, and within insurance and finance also the pension industry. That is where people's savings are. Real estate has to do with people's assets, lands. What I said earlier about accumulation by dispossession, this FIRE is a very important way in which to accumulate. And when we are talking about the service sector and the high growing service sector, it is in this. So it can show high levels of growth, but is there the real returns, and does it have that redistributive value to the people is the big question. So again, what kind of economic vision we have, what kind of economic model are we pursuing, and who is it going to serve? 8% growth under Mahinda Rajapaksa was happening while there was increasing inequality. So it is from which vantage point we look at the economy. What is lacking in this budget? Now the biggest allocation has been for education. Right? Now for the first time, the allocation for education is even higher than defense. Yeah. The budget for defense this year is 307 billion rupees. The total allocation for education is 339 billion rupees. This is a reality. Now the issue is, this allocation for education is not focusing on teachers or trying to relieve the burdens of parents who continue to pay for their children. Even though we have free education, people are forced to somehow continue to pay. So I think that is the issue. You know, if we want to, rural education is in crisis, rural schools are in crisis. They have finally agreed to, you know, build everything from toilets, provide electricity. Those kinds of things are very positive things in the budget in terms of education. They are even thinking of building teachers' quarters, but there still is lacking investment in teachers, which I think the pension is a side thing, or it's one of the benefits, but they really need to realize that there needs to be much more investment in school teachers. Maybe university teachers, because of the struggles, there has been much more of a allocation. In terms of agriculture and land, that is basically the World Bank's recommendation. They want people off the land. They want the agglomeration of land, because they also see this smaller plots of land, as you're saying, which has been going on in Sri Lanka now for almost 5 decades. But the idea is, if people leave the land, then larger plots can even be, you know, more intensive agriculture, including agri-businesses, can take it over. That is the vision, right? Now, my question is this. I think, I'm not sure I fully followed what Dhanusha was saying, but there is something called, you know, rural provisioning. In other words, how the economy works in the rural area is maybe not the way in which we think of the macro economy. Why do people continue to stay in the rural area? It is not that they are unwilling to move. Many of them from the rural areas are going all the way to the Middle East and then coming back to the village, because they know that if they leave the village or their rural area, even a decent housing, decent living standard in terms of even a small garden, what they can get out of that will be lacking if they are pushed into the city. This has been a central question in peasant studies, about how we understand the rationality of the rural society, which they are not, you know, even Marxists used to think that, you know, Marx also called peasants a sack of potatoes, because if you're thinking in terms of this kind of industrial capitalism, they don't fit the rationality. But there's another rationality in terms of, if they don't see the jobs in the city, why would they move to the city? But they're willing to go to the Middle East, earn something and come back, because they are trying to protect their way of life. And I think we have to study that much more carefully than to prescribe easy solutions. The other is how these things work in what we call the long durée, over the longer period of history. Now, what is, I think, really fascinating, not from an economic point of view, but maybe from a sociological, political point of view, is the history of rice in this country, right? I mean, people eat in a lot of places even rice 3 times a day, but look at all the biggest struggles in this country. 1953 Hartal was about when they increased the price of rice. They increased the price of rice when Sri Lanka was only producing 25% of the rice consumed in this country. 35 years later, they were producing 75% of the rice. Now I think we are almost self-sufficient in the production of rice. Why do the governments do that? There's also another rationality to it, because they are afraid of what happens when there's a crisis of basic food. That is where there were subsidies, but it is also, if you look at Asian countries, the story of rice in Sri Lanka is quite phenomenal. To go from 25% to you're producing all the rice, I mean, rice being the most basic fundamental commodity that people in this country want. So I think when you look at it on the long spectrum like this, we can say, okay, in 5 years suddenly there's going to be industrialization and so on. But what happens over the longer term? There is, I think, another rationality of how rural people think and work in this economy, and their struggles also reflect that, and their politics also reflect that, which is not captured often in a macroeconomic analysis. No, I'm not saying the people in the rural societies are happy with the situations. It's obviously a very severe situation. But I'm saying that compared to moving to the urban areas, from their point of view, they're better off staying where they are, keeping their land, and particularly in relation to land, to give up that land that they have in the rural area or in the village. To them, keeping that and maintaining that land is extremely important. That if they lose that, they lose everything by going to the city.
We are not saying that they, in such a system, that they will have to lose their land, or neither they would. Now there's a theory where the labor is transferred from agriculture to industry, a sectoral transition without a geographical transition. That is, you don't need to pluck the labor from the rural areas and throw it into the urban areas. You can still industrialize while you transfer the labor from this particular backward sector to the more modern sector without geographically changing its location.
Yeah, no, I was responding to the whole question of land, right, of the World Bank's policy towards urbanization, about marketing land, which this government is also now thinking of doing, which is to physically move people off from the rural areas into urban areas to build much larger cities. The megapolis vision is also part of that, right? To put people in apartment complexes or whatever out of, and that kind of rural urban migration and construction, why people will resist that is what I was saying. So now, and also because they realize, maybe from their experience of our state over the long durée, that they are not going to get these kinds of industrial jobs.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
So these governments they'll never get.
So they are not willing to take the risk to give up what they have, and what they have is in terms of food security and so on. It's not I'm not saying they're happy with where they are, but it allows some amount of survival, which is what I think we can also draw from the kind of agricultural economy here, because even though it only produces 10% of our GDP, in terms of food security, in terms of rural provisioning, it continues to be very important, of just sustaining the bare minimum, right? Not